Hello, my quilty friends. It's Stacy of Stacy Creates Stuff, and today we are going to learn how to set our block of the week, patching a hole in the barn door, in 2 different settings. Now, last week I showed you how to create a lap quilt, which is what I created. But sometimes a lap quilt might be a little on the small side and you want to make it bigger and you just don't want to keep adding borders. I totally get that. And when I originally designed this as a block of the month pattern, 20 some years ago, I offered 3 different settings. The lap quilt, which I've actually changed slightly and presented the more updated one last week. And I also offered a twin and a queen size. So today I'm going to show you how you can do the twin and how you can do the queen size. So there are timestamps in the description below if you want to kind of skip ahead to the part that you are interested in. I will tell you that the twin size is the most versatile. So you probably want to watch that because there's some really cool tricks that you could do. You could probably even expand that one into a queen size. Anyhow, let's get started with what you will need to make the twin size. For the scrappy twin, because remember this is a perfect project for using up your scraps, you will need the following yardage requirements. Of background fabric, 1 1/4 yards. These are used for the checkerboards and the flying geese. And of course you can use scraps. It can be scraps that total about 1 1/4 yards. From print fabrics, you will also need 1 1/4 yards. And again, these will be used for the checkerboard and the flying geese. And you'll see what I mean by those in just a moment. There's an inner border. You'll need 1/2 yard. For the outer border, you'll need 1 1/2 yards. And for the binding, 5/8 yard. If you're going to use the same fabric for the outer border and the binding, you can just do 2 yards instead of 2 1/8. On the backing, if you're using 1 single fabric, you will need 4 yards. Longarm quilters may require that you need a little bit more of a margin, and you could just use scraps or muslin or something like that to add on some additional bits to the backing at the top and bottom in order to give your longarm quilter enough margin in order to do the quilt. I'm going to put up a graphic on the screen so that you can see what I'm talking about regarding the checkerboard and the flying geese. Essentially, these are borders or rows, really, that can be inserted between the blocks to give some more length to make the quilt a twin size. So the cutting instructions for making the checkerboard, and if you make 2 6-inch rows of checkerboard, then you will need 128 2-inch squares from the background fabrics and 128 2-inch squares from the print fabrics. And of course, these can be a whole variety of prints. The scrappier, the better. In addition to that, there is the checkerboard, a thin checkerboard border. It's only 3 inches tall at the top and at the bottom. And for those, you will need 68 more 2-inch squares from the background. You will need 68 more print fabric squares, and all of these squares are cut 2 inches. For the flying geese, from your background fabrics, you will need a total of 64 3.5-inch squares. And from your print fabrics, you will need 32 3.5 by 6.5-inch rectangles. And this will allow you to make 2 flying geese rows. From the inner border fabric, you're going to cut 6 2-inch strips, and you will sew all those together into one very long strip. From the outer border fabric, you will cut 7 6.5-inch strips. And again, you will sew those all together into one very long strip. From the binding, you will also need 7 strips. These can be cut 2.5 inches. If you prefer your binding to be cut from 2.25-inch strips, then you'll need 7 2.25, but 7 strips of binding. And from your backing, you will take your 4-yard piece, cut it into two 2-yard pieces, seam together, and that is going to give you a horizontal seam in the center of the quilt. And as I mentioned before, if you're planning to send this to a Longarm quilter or you're Longarm quilting it yourself, you may need to add a piece of fabric at the top and the bottom so that your Longarm quilter has a little bit more yardage to connect the quilt frame to. And that additional fabric probably will not be included in the quilt. There should be enough yardage in the 2 widths of the fabric to be able to cover the quilt top. It is going to be cutting it a little close. So if you feel like maybe you'll add a fun little pieced thing in between, maybe some checkerboard, maybe some flying geese, you could certainly do that and stick that somewhere in the midst of the backing. If you want to know more about piecing a really fun backing, you can see last week's video because that's how I did my backing for the lap size quilt. I added some fun little bits in there to give myself a little bit more room. I didn't have a single fabric that would work for the back. So piecing a back is a super fun way to go. So let's talk about the assembly of this quilt. It is basically just rows of blocks or checkerboard or flying geese. Now, the really fun thing is that these checkerboard and flying geese rows are 6 inches tall, and you could swap them around in various places. You could also take sections of them or make some additional pieces to fill in if you don't do all 12 of the big main blocks. When I originally did this, there were a couple of blocks that people were like, I don't really love that block in particular. I don't want to try that technique. And so using the mini blocks was a great way to change those out. 4 of these will equal 1 big block, and you could substitute that in as 4 together, or as I did in this, I have 2 stacked on top of each other, 1 block and 1 large block, and then 2 more of these stacked on top of each other. And so that just makes a really fun way to move things around. And you could do that. You could replace big blocks with mini blocks all over the quilt. For the way that I have it laid out here in the diagram, though, you will need 11 of the blocks of the week. So pick your favorite 11. You will need 4 mini blocks. You will need 32 flying geese, and the cutting instructions are to make those 32 geese. You will need 2 rows of checkerboard that are 4 squares high by 32 squares long. Plus you will need 2 checkerboard borders at the top and the bottom, and those are 2 squares high by 34 squares long. Making the mini blocks is easy. I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of how that goes. The assembly, though, is just like any of the larger blocks. For that, you will need 2 2.5-inch squares in your background fabric, 4 1.25-inch by 3.5-inch rectangles, and 1 3.5-inch square. That'll be the center. Then of your fabric part, the sort of colorful part of the block, you will also do 2 2.5-inch squares and 4 1.25 by 3.5-inch rectangles. And of course, these little rectangles will go together to make the sides. So I'll just lay out the whole block here so you can see. And then these squares will become half square triangles. So I will pair those up, draw right on the diagonal, and then sew just inside of 1/4 inch from that diagonal. I've shown this many times in the past videos. You can go back and watch the starter block video. I demonstrated a few different times throughout the series, but essentially a block like this will go in each corner, and that makes your mini. So I'll sew all my half square triangles. I will sew these little rectangle sections together, and then I will sew in rows. And voila, now we have a completed block. To make the flying geese, you can refer back to the instructions in block 9, which was called Circle of Geese. Now, these flying geese are a different dimension, but the construction is exactly the same. And of course, you won't be circling these geese around a square. They'll just be individual flying geese units that you sew together into a row. For the checkerboard rows, I'd recommend making little 6-inch blocks of checkerboard, and those blocks would be constructed with 16 squares total. So 8 of the background and 8 of the print fabrics. 2 of these little 6-inch checkerboard blocks sewn together will equal the width of a big block. They should be 12.5 inches before they're sewn together even further, and they would finish at 12 inches. So this is a good way to sort of match things up as you're sewing that border together. You can kind of measure them against one of your main quilt blocks. To make the entire row of checkerboard, you would sew together 8 of these 6-inch checkerboard blocks. For the checkerboard border, I would recommend sewing together the squares into one long row, alternating between the print and the background. You will need a total of 34 squares to make a single row, and then you will make a total of 4 of these rows. 2 will get sewn together to be on the top, and 2 will get sewn together to be on the bottom. And you can adjust by sewing a little bit more seam if they're a little too wide. Or if you're finding they're a little short, then you can rip out that seam and sew a more scant seam. You probably won't have to do that for all of the seams. You just need to make probably minor adjustments across. When I did the little squares border on my lap size quilt, the first one that I did came out too long. And so I just had to go back and on occasional seams, just sew a little bit more, and that made it fit perfectly. You can set those checkerboard borders aside for a moment and go ahead and sew on your inner border. Now, the best way to measure for this, and this is why I didn't give you precise measurements, because everybody's is going to be slightly different, but you will want to lay your quilt out on a flat surface. You're going to measure down the left side, down the right side, and down the center of your quilt top. Make sure it's nice and pressed, and you'll take those 3 measurements, add them together, divide by 3, use your calculator on your phone. No shame in using the calculator. Hopefully your measurements are pretty close to each other, maybe off by 1/4 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch, and you will come out with a measurement. You are going to cut 2 strips from your very long inner border strip that you have, having sewn all 6 of those strips, 2-inch strips together. You will cut 2 of them, the measurement that you came out to as the average, and you'll go ahead and sew that, one to the left side, one to the right side. You're going to repeat this process now by measuring across the top of the quilt, the bottom of the quilt, and the center, through the center of the quilt, including those borders you just sewed on. Again, take those 3 measurements, add them together, divide by 3, and that is going to give you the length of the strips you're going to need for the top and the bottom. So you can go ahead and cut those 2 strips and assemble those. After you've sewn those, you can go ahead and add on your checkerboard borders to the top and the bottom. Press all that nice and flat again. You're going to measure the left side, the right side, and down the center. This is going to give you the measurement for your outer border strips. And these are going to be the strips that go on the left side and the right side. So once you've gotten that measurement, you're going to go ahead and sew those. Lay your quilt down last time and measure across the top, the bottom, and through the center. You're going to take those 3 measurements, add them together, divide by 3, and that is the length that you're going to need to cut a top and a bottom outer border. Sew those on and give yourself a pat on the back. Your quilt top is done. Now it's just time to prepare your backing if you haven't already, and your binding. Either quilt it on your own home machine, or if you have a long arm, or send it off to a long arm quilter. If you are looking for a long arm quilter, I highly recommend Lauren of Garden Girl Studios. She is the one who quilted my lap size quilt, and she made a video on her YouTube channel all about the process of quilting my quilt. So I will link in the description below her video on how that all came together. It's really fascinating, especially if you've never long arm quilted or never sent a quilt to a long arm quilter. She gives you some tips and tricks and tells you about her process, which is fabulous. So I love how my quilt turned out. It is, if I could have done it myself, that is exactly how I would have done it. So everything from the thread color that she chose to the design that she chose, I love it. So now let's talk about the queen size quilt. You may be thinking to yourself, how can you take 12-inch blocks and magically get a queen size quilt out of it when you stuck them together and made a lap size? Well, it does involve a lot more fabric, and I've set it on a diagonal. Here's what that quilt works up to look like. So again, I haven't colored it in because I don't want to influence people on how it could turn out. If you're on the mailing list, then you would have gotten the coloring sheet so that you can play around with designing how you're going to lay this out. You can also do this as a scrappy quilt by varying the fabrics for the setting squares and the triangles. You could also do scrappy sashing, either by piecing together pieces to make the sashing or just using a bunch of different fabrics for the sashing. The yardage requirements for the queen size quilt is you will need 1 1/4 yards of fabric for the setting squares and the posts. The posts are the small squares that are between the sashing. And again, you can use scraps that total about 1 1/4 yards. For the sashing, you will need 1 3/4 yards of fabric. For the inner border, you will need 1 yard. For the outer border, you will need 1 7/8 yards. For the binding, you will need 7/8 yards. The backing requires 6 yards of fabric. And again, if you are sending your quilt to a long arm quilter, you may need to add some additional fabric. This time it would be on the sides of the quilt. And this fabric that you add would not be quilted in. It's just to give some extra inches so that your long arm quilter can attach your quilt back to their quilting frame. The cutting instructions for this setting: from the setting squares fabrics, you will need a total of 6 12.5-inch squares. Yes, they are big. You will need 4 9.5-inch strips, and you are going to subcut these into triangles, and I'm going to show you that so that you can see what I'm talking about. So here is a strip of fabric, and I am going to show you how you can use your regular ruler, as long as it has a 45-degree mark on it, to figure out how to cut those large triangles. And the reason I'm doing it this way is because if you have cut your strip the width of the fabric, then you are going to have these side triangles that do not have a bias edge. And that way you will not get a fun ripply side and to your quilt tops and sides. So with your strip of fabric, you are going to find that 45-degree mark on your ruler, and you are going to put that right along the edge. And if I move it all the way up, so I'm just past the selvage, so I didn't really even need to trim off the selvage, then my first cut can be right along here. There we go. Now you can see a little bit more. You can make that first cut along here. Now I'm not actually going to cut this strip because I need this fabric for a different project. Once you have that cut, then this would be the point. So we've cut off that triangle. Let's do this. Okay. Now you can imagine that that piece is gone. And then I am going to, again, look for the 45-degree angle on my ruler. And on my particular ruler, the 45-degree meets up with the 7-inch mark. Yours may be in a different location, but you want to look for where that 45-degree angle meets up with a line on the ruler, whether it's 7 inches or someplace else. And you're going to use that line along the edge of your cut piece. Now, remember, I've just folded mine back because I need this fabric. And then I would go ahead and cut along there. That is going to create your triangle. This would be the triangle then for the ends of your diagonal rows. Now you would be able to continue along your strip. This triangle would then go the other way, and you should be able to get 3 triangles out of a single strip. You will need to cut 2 3.5-inch strips. These are for the posts, and you will subcut these into 17 3.5-inch squares. You will need to cut 4 6-inch squares, and you will cut each of these twice on the diagonal. Here is a 6-inch square, and I am simply going to align my ruler from one corner to the other corner. Cut that. Now, I wouldn't actually recommend separating it the way I did that way. I would just keep that on your cutting surface and then put your ruler from the other one corner to the other corner and the opposite ones you did before. Carefully cut those. And there you have your 4 small triangles. And again, this will have a knot bias. So these will match up with be the ends of your sashing rows on the diagonal, and not having the bias along the top and the sides of your quilt will keep your quilt from getting all wavy. These 6-inch squares that get cut on the diagonal, you may be able to get out of the leftover bit from those 9-inch strips. So before you cut 6-inch squares, cut those triangles out first from the 9.5-inch strips, and then you will have fabric left from those that you can further use for these posts and these squares that become triangles. From the sashing fabric, you're going to cut 5 12.5-inch strips. You will subcut these into 48 3.5 by 12.5-inch rectangles. Now, if your fabric is a good 42 or more inches, you really only need 4 strips. You'll be able to get 48 rectangles out of it. If, however, the width of the fabric that you're using for the sashing is less than 42 inches, even a little bit less, you will not be able to get that 12th rectangle out of the strip, and that's why you would need an additional strip. So cut one 12.5-inch strip, subcut that, and if you get 12 out of it, you only would need a total of 4 12.5-inch strips. From your inner border, you're going to cut 8 3.5-inch strips, and you can sew all those together into one long strip. From your outer border, you're going to cut 10 6-inch strips. And again, you can sew those into one very long strip. There is enough fabric yardage included in here, a number of strips, so that if you do a mitered join for your strips versus a butt join, you will still have plenty of fabric. And from your backing, you will cut 2 3-yard pieces, sew those together along the selvage edges, and that will create a center vertical seam for your backing. And as I mentioned before, if you are sending to a Longarm quilter, you will likely need some additional fabric on the left and right sides in order for the quilter to attach it to the Longarm frame. To assemble the queen size quilt, these blocks are set on point and the rows are diagonal rows. You'll want to arrange your blocks as desired, filling in the sashing and post and setting blocks as pictured on the coloring sheet guide. Rows of an on-point quilt are sewn diagonally. Once you have each row sewn, then you will sew the rows to each other. You are going to lay your quilt out flat on a surface. And I realize with a queen size quilt, this may be a bit of a challenge. And just as we did with all the other borders for the lap size quilt and the twin size quilt, we are going to measure along the left side, the right side, and the center. Add those 3 measurements together, divide by 3. You will take that measurement and cut 2 inner border strips the length. You'll lay out your quilt again, and this time measure across the top, the bottom, and through the center. Add those 3 measurements together, divide by 3, and this is the length of this strip. You will need 2 to go across the top and the bottom from the inner border strip. You're going to repeat that process again for the outer border. Left side, right side, center. Cut your outer border lengths from that average. Those will go on the side. Measure once more across the top, bottom, and through the center. Add those 3, divide by 3, and that gives you the length of the outer border strip for the top and the bottom. Once you have all those sewn together, your quilt top is done. Congratulations. At this point, you can prepare your backing and your binding and go ahead and quilt your quilt or send off to a Longarm quilter. As I mentioned before, Lauren of Garden Girl Studios quilted my lap size quilt, and I love it. I highly recommend her. She is a dream to work with. She has lots of different options, from free motion quilting to using a pantograph pattern. She took extra consideration knowing that one of the blocks had dimension to it. That was the bow tie block. I loved the loops and swirls that she chose for this design. It was fantastic. And again, you can watch her quilt my quilt over on her YouTube channel, link in the description below. I will also link to her video at the end of this video on one of the cards. So you can simply click on that and go and watch her work her magic. My friends, that concludes this Block of the Week series. Now, if you're on my mailing list, you are going to get one more email from me where I wrap everything up. And I'm also contemplating what is next. I think I'm going to hold off on a full Block of the Week series for just a few weeks, as I have some other things planned for this summer. But I think in the fall, I will start up another series. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm abandoning quilting by any means. Be sure to subscribe to my channel if you love all things quilting and fiber art. Not only do I do quilting and some sewing, but I also do cross stitch and embroidery, and very soon, I promise, knitting. Until next time, my friends, keep in stitches. This is Stacy, and I will see you again.